see. All right. Okay. Wow, it's a packed house for a talk about houses. Well, do we want to close the door back there? Are there more people trying to get in, or? Okay. Oh, I don't. All right.
We'll have to buy the recording.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Okay. So I was just in India, and I feel like in India they could fit like twice as many people in this room. So I have there's a lot to get through today, so I want to go ahead and get started. So we're talking about, I titled this talk, The Secret Symbolism of the Fifth House. Is that how it showed up in the program? Yeah. But good, because there's a lot of people here, so I try to trick you all. So it had a catchy title, oh, I'm going to learn a secret today, so I'm going to go to that talk. No, I'm just kidding. There's a lot to be learned about the houses, and I've been really passionate about them for like the last year. So I'm hoping that everyone will come away with kind of a new understanding of the fifth house and all of the topics associated with the fifth house. So there's many, and it's a really rich, beautiful house. So hopefully, yeah, we'll get into it here. All right, so let's start with just a few. And can everyone see the screen? Okay. I'm recording this for a bunch of people who can't be here and stuff like that. I said I'll try to record it. So
move your camera to
should I move like this, like over there? Yeah. Okay, is that good? Okay. All right, so
I don't see any.
So why should we want to understand the underlying symbolic or sort of secret rationale behind any house, let alone the fifth house? That's a good place to start. Obviously, the sort of purpose of this talk is to try and understand what is it that brings together all of the various topics of the fifth house. So why do we have like children, creativity, pregnancy, things like taverns or ale houses, or performance, recreation, theater, sports, your parents' wealth. Why are all these different topics over the vast history of astrology, why do they all come together in this place? What is it that unifies all these topics? So, but we can do that with any house, and that's what I've been really interested in for like the past year or so. So it's a good place to start, though, is just to ask the question, what's at stake? Why even look into this? So we're going to take a look at that first. So just kind of going piece by piece, here's what we're going to do. First, we're going to just ask, why do this? Then we're going to, after we kind of take a look at that question, then we're going to explore the idea of what are called angular triads, or angular or busy places in general, and then the grouping of houses around the angular positions in the chart, house 1, 10, 7, and 4, and groupings of houses surrounding those angular places. That's going to be a key part of how we break down the meaning of the fifth house, the underlying unifying factors of the fifth house. We're going to talk about the importance of primary and secondary motions of the planets, alongside of this Greek word called praxis, which is very similar to the Indian word karma. We're going to talk a little bit about that. Then we're going to talk about the topics and meanings of the fourth house, which is the angular house that's intimately related to the fifth house. You kind of have to, it's like scaffolding. We have to build an understanding of the angle that the fifth house is moving into in order to understand the topics of the fifth house and the underlying unity behind the fifth house. So that's what we're going to work our way into. So we'll talk about the fourth house a little bit. Then we're going to talk about the topics of the fifth house. And then we're going to talk about the way in which primary and secondary motions in the fifth house, what kind of motion does a planet have in the fifth house, and how does that relate to the topics of the fourth house and generate the topics of the fifth? So that might sound really complicated, right? But that's why I'm listing it piece by piece. So that also after this talk, I'll give you my email address, and if you want these slides, you'll have a really organized way of going back and looking over a kind of complicated set of ideas. So finally, what we want to do is figure out how these complicated motions in the fifth house relative to the fourth house generate the topics. And then we want to talk about the deeper karma and lessons of the fifth house, because it's not just a set of topics. It turns out that every house also is giving us a lesson about karma. And so that's where we're going. That's the journey we're on here. By the way, I'm Adam. I didn't really introduce myself, so nice to meet all of you. All right, so what's at stake? Why do we want to understand the underlying unifying or symbolic rationale behind or within a house? Why would we want to do that? Because if all we ever have is a list of topics, whether they're modern or ancient or whatever, because typically we break down the line of like, well, I like the old traditional meaning topics of the houses, like the sixth house. I'm sorry, you're going to break your arm. It has nothing to do with service. And someone other house is like, no. The sixth house is all about stately service and helping people. And that's where we end up. The debate ends up getting divided along those lines. It's not so much what brings all of these different topics together over the vast history of astrology, but rather which topics do I like better? You know what I mean? Which ones do I feel are more real or traditional, or which ones are more sensitive and sensitive to the needs of a client? Or those are all important lines of the debate about houses. But I want to look at how did ancient astrologers come up with all these topics per house, right? So that's what I'm really interested in. So if we only ever have a list of topics for every house, that doesn't really teach us to read situations uniquely. Instead, what it encourages us to do is see every personal individual life as a reflection of different combinations of adjectives and nouns and things from lists. And then we have to work from that point to make it personal. Rather than what I hope we'll do today is give you some understanding of the underlying symbolic unity behind the house that then allows you to take that deeper underlying unity and apply it personally. It's ready to go right away. You don't have to work from topics backward to being personal. You start with the underlying depth and sort of archetypal unity of the house, and that immediately is personal. So lists of topics without underlying unity also don't teach us to see the temples or the houses as the abiding places of the planets or the planetary deities. So really the way that ancient astrologers looked at houses and signs long ago, this is the dawn of like Hellenistic Greco-Roman astrology, was that houses and signs were coinciding with one another. You could think of it sort of like an elaborate tarot deck in the sky with 12 card positions. So if you're going to do a 12 card spread, you have 12 cards in 12 positions. The signs became one of the 12 positions as they rotated through the sky. We know that that's at least a predominant way that ancient astrologers had of looking at whole sign houses. They had other quadrant-based forms of division as well, but that was conceptually and theoretically, that was the foundation of how houses were understood and how the symbolic rationale behind the houses were understood. So if we don't understand this deeper rationale behind the houses, then we aren't really seeing the houses as the abodes of the gods. We're not really seeing them as the places where these varying deities live, and where they have different likes and dislikes and different kinds of harmony and disharmony and things like that. So this hopefully will also this exploration helps us to sort of reanimate the houses, not just as sets of topics, but as homes of gods, and what those look and feel like in a dynamic sky that's always moving. We sometimes forget that because all we have to do on a software now is just click, calculate, and the chart's like boom right there, and we forget that that's actually an artificially freeze-framed moment of a sky that never really stops moving. And we have to understand that houses are based on the perpetual movements of the sky. So at any rate, and also because a lot of us as astrologers, I know that one of the reasons that I got curious about this topic is because I didn't understand why the topics were the way that they were. It's like the elephant in the room. Someone would be like, so tell me why the third house is related to writing. And I'd be like, well, because of Mercury. And they'd be like, oh, well, why is Mercury related to the third house? Oh, because of Gemini. Why is Gemini related to the third house? Oh, well, because it's the house of writing. You know what I mean? So round and round you go. And so in modern astrology, a brilliant invention and a somewhat troubling invention. It does have a history within our field, but is what's sometimes called the 12-letter alphabet. So it's where we conflate signs and planets and houses all together at once. So Aries equals Mars equals the first house, Taurus equals Venus equals the second house. Ancient astrologers didn't actually look at things this way. There was some way of aligning signs, planets, and houses, for example, in medical astrology, where you see the body laid out according in that manner. But yeah, for example, traditionally the moon was associated with the third house. Today, most people, we studied modern astrology, we think of Mercury as related to the third house. And there's lots of beautiful reasons for this. And there's interesting levels of archetypal association to arranging the houses with signs and planets in the way that we do, the 12-letter alphabet, so that Mercury and Gemini, there is a kind of archetypal correspondence with the third house. It's not like something we have to throw out altogether. But if we want to understand the topical rationale behind the houses, you have to start with the idea that the topical rationale of the houses are not based upon the signs. They're not based upon the planets primarily either. They're based on movements of planets through the sky in the 24-hour day. So that's where we're going to start. We're going to start with that and set aside the idea that the houses are conflated with planets and signs. So understanding all of this helps us to get into the sort of mystical intelligence and way of thinking that generated the original symbolism of the houses in astrology. And when we're in touch with that kind of imagination, that way of thinking, everything becomes more intuitive and everything becomes more person-centered. So we don't have to reverse engineer our way back to being person-centered astrologers. But we do that when we start with nothing but wrote lists of topics. Then we feel like we're missing something personal, and then we go out and we overcompensate. So let's go on. So during the 1990s, some of you may be familiar with Project Hindsight, which was a translation project that got together in order to translate a large body of original Greco-Roman Hellenistic source texts, critical editions that were put together by scholars. It was called the CCAG. These scholars were not really necessarily interested in doing astrology. They were scholars of Greek literature and astronomy and things like that. And so they put together this large compendium called I'm going to mess this up, the catalog. Does anyone know how to say the whole thing? The catalog. It's something like the catalog compendium of the astrology of the Greeks. That's close. So look it up because you'll get the full thing. Anyway, so they had this body of critical editions of the Greek source texts, and they decided to start translating them. I think they were even inspired by, if I remember the story correctly, Chris Brennan would know it like that. The story is that they were at an astrology conference and they got together, and it was Robert Schmidt, Robert Zoller, Robert Hand, so the Bobs all got together collectively and decided, hey, let's put our brains together. And Schmidt was the real sort of translator of the, he was the one who had real in-depth knowledge of the Greek. So he did most of the translations. Robert Hand did a lot of the editing. And anyway, they sort of started doing this. And during that time, Schmidt was working on trying to understand some of the esoteric rationale behind or within Hellenistic astrology. So one of the terms that he coined during that period was called sets of houses, 4 sets of 3 houses that he called the angular triads. And the reason that he called them the angular triads is because he noticed that, first of all, the Greek astrologers, and when we say Greek, we're not talking necessarily ethnically Greek, right? We're talking about the Greek, the Hellenistic world, Greek speaking. But he noticed that the astrologers gave primary importance to the angular houses, 1, 10, 7, 4. And they called them kentrons. Has anyone ever heard that word before? Is this totally new? Okay. So kentron, one of the meanings of the word kentron is basically like a very busy or active place in the wheel. It's like a very busy hub of activity. So how many of you in your practice pay attention to planets in angular houses already, right? Raise your hand. Okay, so lots of people know that that's meaningful. Well, that's been meaningful in astrology for thousands of years. Greek astrologers placed primary importance in planets that were rising, culminating, setting, or anti-culminating. These four kind of just like in shamanic ceremonies, we face all four directions, right? So the four directions, the four kind of cardinal points of the chart had primary importance. They were also thought of as like pivots, places around which a planet is sort of swiveling, or they were thought of as like goads, place where a planet is like, you know, kind of kicked into action like you're spurring a horse. So you see the planet kind of get extra empowered when it comes into an angle. If you ever watch astrology in your day-to-day, or if you practice horary or anything like that, where you're kind of casting a chart for the moment of a question or something like that. For example, the other day, I'm from DC, so I follow the Capitals, the hockey team, barely, but I follow them a little bit. And it's pretty exciting that they're playing to go to the Stanley Cup, right? If they win this Game 7, so I cast a horary chart, are they going to win Game 7? And their signifier was conjoined the midheaven, right? So of course, like victory, right? And they won. So, you know, but that's really old, being able to identify that a planet is greatly empowered because it's conjoined one of the angles, whether that's degree-based or whole sign. If it's in an angular house or at one of the degree-based angles, it's powerful. So he noticed that they gave this primary importance. In fact, all of the houses that they considered to be most dynamic and active, they used the word krematistikos. And among other things, that word meant that it had the power to speak as an oracle. How many of you guys have ever cast a tarot spread before? And there's a card in one of the power positions, perhaps, and it's like a major arcana, and it just, boom, it stands out, and the whole spread will somehow constellate itself around that one omen that's speaking in a powerful position in the spread. Have you ever had that happen? Okay, everyone knows that experience. That's what a kentron is. That's what a krematistikos place is. It's a place where whatever planets are in that position are sort of popping. So he noticed this, and then he said, it's interesting that they gave the primary importance to these places, and then the names, the generic theoretical names for the rest of the houses, center around their relationship to angular houses. For example, you have you guys all know what a succedent house is, 11, 8, 5, and 2. So those post-ascensional houses, they were called, or succedent houses, are named specifically in relation to the angle. Why are they called a succedent house? Because they succeed the angle. So they're moving to become the angle next. I'll show you an example of this in a moment. Whereas on the other hand, the other houses that are on the other sides of the angles are called declining or cadent houses. We call them cadent houses today. They're called declining houses. And they're all houses that were most recently in the angular position, but have declined away from or fallen out of the angular position of power. So let's see, I'll just show you an example of what this looks like. It's, if I can get it up here. Oops. Let's see. If I can, like, it's not letting me expand it for some reason. Okay, well, I'll just show you like this. Okay, so you have, these are all whole sign houses, right? So notice that a succeeding house, by means of the primary motion of the sky, which carries all of the signs, all of the planets, in the same uniform motion, day in and day out, right? So things rise in the east, and then they culminate overhead, and then they set in the west, and then they go down and they anti-culminate, and then they rise again. So it's like a carousel going around and around the same direction. Does that make sense to everyone? Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. So then, basically, what we're looking at is, by the means of the primary motion, every succeeding house will become, in time, the angular house next. So if you're moving by whole sign houses, Cancer is right here, but where's the primary motion of the sky bringing to next? What house? It'll become the 10, right? The primary motion of the sky will keep rising, that section of zodiac, the stars and planets and so forth. It'll rise up and become the 10. Okay, house 8. House 8, where is it heading next? To become what house? 7. House 5, where is it going next? 4. House 2, 1. Okay, so all of the houses, the succeeding houses, are so named because of how they relate to the angle that they flank. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. Same thing with declining houses. A declining house, most recently was the 9th, was what house prior to being this house? It was 10, but now it's fallen away. It's declined away, and it's become the 9th. 6 was 7, but it's declined away. 3 was, but it's declined away. And 12 was, but it's declined So Schmidt noticed that the most broad theoretical rationale behind the organization of the houses first involves the importance of the angles, and then the flanking houses on either sides of the angles being named in relation to whether they're moving in or falling out. Okay, everyone with me so far? I want to make sure because this kind of gets a little complicated. So, so he said, well, that's clear then that what they're doing is they're organizing houses into clusters of 3. You have an angle plus 2 flanking houses. So 11, 10, and 9 are grouped together. 8, 7, and 6 grouped together. So you have an angle, 1 succeedant, and 1 cadent house on either side. So he said just started with that idea. Then he began hypothesizing. How did they use this rationale, which is clearly based on the primary motion of the sky? How did they use this rationale to establish the topics? So that's kind of his starting point. He was very brilliant in that regard, in my respect. I have a lot of respect for him because I think he was very unique in that regard, where he had a kind of a mind for trying to decode things, you know. At any rate, so he kind of came up with a hypothesis that perhaps the meanings of the houses, meaning all the topics of the houses, were generated from the interrelationships between the flanking houses and the angular houses. So that's the premise that he started from. Let's test that as a hypothesis. So that's what we're going to look at now, is sort of his hypothesis, which I heard him give the basic formulation of in a lecture, a recorded lecture from I think some of the conclaves or meetups that they had in the 1990s. So I heard this and I was really fascinated with it. And then I went and visited him and his wife because I live in Maryland. They don't live far from me. So I was on a yoga retreat and I took a little time off from the yoga retreat and went and sat with them and talked about the houses and stuff like that. And and apparently right now he's also, I saw a newsletter from him not long ago that said he was continuing to work on this. He was still working on this topic, so maybe he'll have more to say. But at any rate, let's start to break this hypothesis down. Let's start with the idea that the angular house topics are arrived at by understanding what planets are doing or how they are appearing to us as they arrive by primary motion to any of the 4 angular places. Okay, so now let's look at the chart again, and let's just give you an example. So the topics of the first house include the first place of the David. We always say that, right? And therefore it's associated with the physical vehicle of the body, health and vitality. It was associated traditionally with new beginnings, the initiation point of new endeavors. Why would this be? Well, because by primary motion, what are planets doing here for the first time in the 24-hour day? They're appearing, they're rising, they're coming into the visible sky. So just as you're coming out of invisible space of your mother's womb at birth, so the stars are being born into the visible sky from the womb beneath the earth. Corresponds, makes easy sense. But also there were some really beautiful metaphors, nautical metaphors were pretty common in a region that was all centered around the Mediterranean. So there's a philosopher Porphyry who's talking about how astrologers agreed during that day and age that the soul was came into the vessel of the body, which was like a boat or a ship, and when it came into the world, it grabbed the steering wheel, and that's the birth line. That's the ascendant marker. So the ascendant was called the helm, the steering wheel of the ship, and it was associated with the inborn gravitational sort of intelligence of the person who was being born.
The better word is rudder, because they didn't have these back then. And like a rudder, the ascendant does that on the east every day.
Right.
So that's what E accosts.
Very good. Yeah, I was just used to steering wheels. It's a little easier, but yeah. But yes. So, but it's associated with like the way you're navigating your ship, right? And then when you so anyway, that's a very basic example. Now, when you get to the top of the sky, again, by means of primary motion, you have something reaching its pinnacle. So you have things like kings, people with the power to judge between life and death. As the planet sits on the sort of fulcrum, you know, the place between what comes up and what goes down, the power to judge. See, is something going to rise? Is it going to fall? The power to judge is up there. The place of fame and notoriety and rank, and et cetera, et cetera. This place is also called praxis by the Greeks, which means action, and it's intimately related to the Indian concept of karma, which also means action. And so your actions in the world and the manifestation of actions in the visible and societal or social realm where everyone can see them. That's our 10th house. So we think of career with the 10th house because that's an obvious, that's like low-hanging fruit for us because that's what we all think of when we think of public action in the world, right? Is your career, your vocation. And it's also, in a much broader sense, it's how you're known by people, you know, in the larger social sphere. But anyway, you see how the topics are being generated in a sense by understanding which part of the 24-hour journey the planet has arrived at, so to speak. Now, when you go into house 7, then you're at the setting place, so the planet is disappearing. Well, now we think of the 7th as a place of love and relationships, right? Everyone's familiar with 7th house, love and relationships. We think of it like a partnership or something. 7th house, by this time, the planet has traveled through the entire sky and is now setting. So it was actually, like Ilias, for example, says it was associated with the end of toils and struggles, the end of toils and strife. Because the planet has gone through the whole sky and is setting. So actually, at the setting place, including the degree of the descendant, you may see things finalized. It's also associated with death. So you may see things like, I can't tell you how many clients I have when something's on the descendant. Okay, yeah, your relationship might end. You also might get married. Why? This is the place not just of relationships, it's really a place of consummation. The planet has finished something. So consummation marks the joining or binding of something when it's done, so to speak. It's hard to explain the concept, but or you can think of like, I can't tell you how many people I've had that they finish their graduate school, or they finish a big piece of work of some kind when something's hanging around the descendant. My wife has Saturn sitting right on her descendant right now. Her grandfather just passed, right? It's stuff like that. So something's setting here. But of course, consummation, marriage, banquets, ceremonies, worship of the gods. This is a liminal space between daytime and nighttime. So it's also connected with, you know, I always say about the 7th house, you don't say to your friend, I'm going out this morning to a concert. No one says that. Most of the time, if you're at a festival, someone says, I'm going to a concert tonight. Why? Because this is the place where we put to rest the daytime world and its concerns. So it's naturally a very romantic house in that respect. It has a much broader meaning in ancient astrology, you might say. It's a lot more diverse than just love and partnerships. So the primary motion of the sky, nonetheless, is still the thing that's giving us the symbolic range. Does that make sense, everyone? Okay. So then the planet gets down to the 4th house, which is our angular house of the day. And here we have things like home, property, family. Everyone's used to those topics in the 4th, right? Okay, so I would make sure you're all with me. So everyone knows that about the 4th house, right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, so we have those topics down here in the 4th. Why? Because this is the place where everything returns to and begins from. Does that not sound like home? Right? So that was one of the things you'll hear. Sometimes you'll hear said in sort of the language of the classical text is it's a place of endings and beginnings. The end and the beginning. Well, the end and the beginning, the place of anti-culmination, is the roots. It's related to your ancestry, where you come from, and where you go back to. It's the grave. It's buried treasures, things that are deep below the earth. It has associations with the underworld, with mysteries, with occult studies, with the past, with things that are hidden, all because it's deep under the earth. And that's, for many of us, when we start exploring, say, the unconscious in a therapy setting, where do we go first? What kind of topics come up? Childhood, right? In your home and your family and stuff like that. And that's because the association of topics with the sort of underworld and the unconscious, and it's a deeply private sphere compared to the 10th, which is so public and all of that. But all of that's generated from the idea of planets anti-culminating deep below the earth. Does that make sense to everyone? So you have to, and this imagination enlivens your practice. When you look at a 4th house planet and you think it's deep below the earth, and you kind of try to imagine it as almost like a dimension or a terrain that the planet is in. It really helps me anyway. All right, so Now, when you look at the houses on either side of those angular places, we have dynamics that are repeating in every single house. In the declining houses, the planets, by secondary motion, and I'll give you a demo of this in a moment, are gazing at the angular place. Their secondary motion, which sort of represents their volition or their will or their intention or direction, is gazing at the angular place, but the primary motion is dragging them away from it. Whereas in a succeedent house, they're turned away from the angular place by secondary motion, and the primary motion is bringing them into the angle. So let's show you how that works. So let's say, for example, in house 9, a planet in house 9 here is in what sign? Taurus. So it's by secondary motion, unless it was retrograde, so just pretend it's not retrograde. The planet in Taurus is heading toward what sign next? Gemini, right? Now, do you notice how that planet is moving against the grain of the primary motion? It's moving this way, but the primary motion is carrying it down. So that interaction is very, very important. And in fact, I can't go into this right now, but there's a lot in common with the underlying logic and rationale of I Ching, which is a Taoist. And when you have contrary motions working in all sorts of different particular situations, the yin and the yang, then from that, you get a range of archetypal scenarios that reflect different kinds of changes happening, archetypal changes. And this is also deeply connected to the basic mystical tenets of the ancient astrologers. They saw the world as a place of fluctuation and change in contrast to the unchanging eternal soul. So many, of the ancient mystics sort of thought that way. So at any rate, you have a planet in the 9th house by secondary motion, which you can think of as the planet's desires or its will or its intention, or where it's going of its own accord by its own speed, its own motion, etc. It's gazing upon the angular 10th house, but it's being pulled away from it by the primary motion. So just to give you a simple example, the 9th house topic, like religion or contemplation of the underlying laws of the cosmos on a spiritual level or something like that, like astrology. Where does that come from? Well, here's the place that's associated with civilization and all of human beings' endeavors and activities, all the skyscrapers we see outside of here, all the stuff that we do, all the action or praxis or karma that keeps us engaged in this worldly life. Well, this place has an eye fixed on it, but it's reclining away from it. It has contemplative distance. You see what I'm saying? So it can contemplate the world, and it's all of the stuff of the world, but it's doing so as it's being cut away from it. Well, whether you're a monk or a scholar, or you're traveling the world or whatever, you're gaining some reflective distance from the world in order to understand how it works. You see what I'm saying? So that's how we get some of the underlying topics of the 9th house according to this sort of theory. So, but there's a lot more that can be said. I'm just giving you a brief example. Now, the succeeding houses, by contrast, let's do house 11. The planet here in Cancer is heading toward what sign next? Leo. So it's moving toward Leo. In this case, all we're going to think about is that the planet is turned away from the angle, meaning it's not focused on it. It's like I'm heading in this direction, I'm being brought in that direction, but I'm not aware of it. So I'm just kind of being like, I think I'm going forward, but I'm being pulled back. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. So the 11th house planet, the 11th house topics, one topic was hopes, wishes, and dreams, right? Well, if you think of someone who had a powerful 11th house, like Martin Luther King Jr.'s, one of the charts you see often, I'm not sure what its Rodan rating is, but it has ascending over Venus, exalted in Pisces in the 11th house, right? And it's famous to go, I have a dream, right? It wasn't, I have a plan, right? It was, I have a dream. So when you're dreaming, you don't see where you're going. Do you see what I'm saying? You're in a state that, in order to dream, you fundamentally, in some way, have to be in a visionary state, not a planning state. This is just a simple example, but planets in this state, in other words, aren't, on some level, they're unconscious of where they're being brought to, and yet it's there. So the 11th house planet, dreams and wishes and hopes, it represents sort of like your higher values. Also all the allies, groups, friends, people that somehow share in your common dreams and values. Well, that's a sign of this planet being brought to a place of manifestation, to the place where it comes into the world and it is reflected in the karmic arena of life. But it's not there yet, right? It's turned away from where it's heading. So it's a dreamer. You see how that works? Okay, so those are just like brief examples. Now let's go from there. I'm trying to hurry up because I usually do this in 90, so I have to turn up the juice a little. Okay, so does everyone get the basic idea that this pattern that I just played out is going to repeat in every angular triad to generate all of the topics? Now we're going to go in depth with the 5th house. So first we have to understand the 4th. The 4th house has been traditionally associated with land, wealth, fathers, parents. Fathers, obviously, because the source of where you come from and return to in a more paternal society long ago would have been your father. Right? But we can change that now, I think, more generally to represent parents. And it seems to have evolved that way anyway. Anyway, it's related to buried treasure, things below the earth, mysteries, because it's in a dark, deep place. The past, old things, death, the beginning and end, the underworld, roots, ancestry, property, a living place, places beneath the ground, minds. So Manilius, who, I love his text, by the way. If you ever get a chance to read Astronomica by Manilius, one of the great reasons to read that text is that he was a poet. And poets naturally have a way of taking you into the substrata. They're not just technicians. They're getting you somehow into the way of thinking that actually generated the symbolism rather than just the nuts and bolts. So some people will say, oh, he's a poet, and we don't know how reliable his text is because maybe there's poetic inflation or whatever. I'm like, no, go there. The poets are the ones who've got the gems. Like, go in that. Anyway, that's just the best thing. Anyway, so Manilius says the next point, though situated in the lowest position, bears the world poised on its eternal base. In outward aspect, its influence is less, but it's greater in utility. It controls the foundations of things and governs wealth. It examines to what extent desires are accomplished by the mining of metal and what gain can issue from a hidden source. He also said, where at the opposite pole the universe subsides, he's moving from talking about the 10th to the 4th, occupying the foundations, and from the depths of midnight gloom gazes up at the back of the earth. In that region, Saturn exercises the powers that are his own, cast down himself in ages past from empire in the skies and the throne of heaven. He wields as a father power over the fortunes of fathers and the plight of the old. Sorry, it's a little typo there. So that, of course, all of that comes from the symbolism of the planets reaching that lowest point in the chart. Is that basic enough for everyone? Any questions about that before I keep going? Okay. So that's the angular 4th. It's a place, the 4th house is a place where you can imagine that it's not just family, but it's the history of the soul. Yeah, and cultures that a lot of them lead to reincarnation, and the perpetual journey of the soul, lifetime after lifetime. So you're thinking of the 4th as the place of the womb and the tomb, the place where the heart is, in a sense, weighed against the feather. And you know that from the Egyptian halls of Ma'at, the Hall of Ma'at. There's a reckoning in the 4th house, and Manilius illustrates that by invoking Saturn, because what happened to Saturn? He was the king of the golden age, right? But then he's usurped by his son, and falls down. So in Saturn, for example, one of the dualities that we see in Saturnine symbolism is both great mystics and contemplatives who have some sense of timeless wisdom, but you also see curmudgeonly Scrooge-like characters, because Saturn represents both the sort of perfection of a bygone age and the memory of it. Yeah, and I could say more about that. I was just at my wife's grandfather passed away last week, right as Uranus entered Taurus, and I was at the funeral, and he was a Capricorn and a World War II vet, And it was like as Saturn as you can get, church and state the whole way. You know what I mean? It was very beautiful, it was lovely, but it was also like, wow, that's Saturn. I can really feel it. And here's Venus coming to oppose Saturn. There's like all these beautiful nostalgic photos laid out and metals everywhere. And I was like, oh gosh, this is. So at any rate, and I was like, my poor wife, she has to hear me like just chomping at the bit to talk about the astrology of it all. Sorry. So at any rate, so you get to the bottom of the chart though, and you're talking about the place where everything, all the karma in the world that's pictured at the top of the chart, the great civilization, the great city, the great whatever it is, eventually it falls. The natural motion of the sky brings it down into that deep place of death and rebirth. Right? So that's just a simple way of thinking. Manilius relates it to Saturn. So you can think about it like that. Now, we need to know that so that when we get into the 5th house, we have some understanding of how the 5th house topics relate to the 4th in that angular grouping. So the 5th house was called good fortune, and it was also called the joy of Venus. Those are two sort of ancient designations that belong to the 5th house. It's traditionally associated with topics like children, pregnancy. I use the broad word recreation. Covers things like sports, taverns, restaurants. You can see the hobbits are dancing on a table here. So performance, creativity, the arts, the parents' or father's fortune. This is maybe a derived house thing a little bit, where you have the 2nd house from the 4th, which is the financial house of the parents. So there's derived houses that are used throughout. Everyone familiar with derived houses pretty much? Okay. So at any rate, if you're not, it's something interesting to check out maybe later. All manner of enjoyable, pleasant, or sensual things. Just think of it as Venus's hangout spot. Venus really likes this house. As Venus rejoices in this place. Manilius said, like this temple, the 11th, but with an inverse likeness, now talking about the 5th, is that which is thrust below the world and entwines the named hair of the submerged heaven. You see how even Manilius is talking about the 5th in relation to its shining in the 4th. Joins the named hair of the submerged heaven, and which shines in the opposite region. Wearied after completion of active service, it is again marked out for a further term of toil, as it waits to shoulder the yoke of the cardinal temple and its role of power. Not as yet does it feel the weight of the world, but already aspires to that honor. So he's being very poetical here, but one of the things he's saying is that planets in this house are hanging out, marked out for, let's just use the analogy of reincarnation. You're hanging out and you're having fun in the 5th house, but you're about to get a reboot. You're about to hit another incarnation and go through again. You don't know it yet, so it's time to hang out and have fun. Okay, so that's a very simple. I don't need to, there's much more nuance and depth to it, but that's a simple way of looking at it. So how do we see all of these topics reflected in the primary and secondary motion? Let's bring up our wheel again. So with the 5th house planet, you're looking at the planet in Capricorn here is heading toward what sign by secondary motion? Aquarius. So it's moving from Capricorn toward Aquarius. But the primary motion is bringing it where? Down to the 4th. So that's where it's heading. So it's turned away from, you can say unconscious stuff, aware, this state that is either averse to or turned away from the reality of where it's being brought. For example, the 8th house, why is it associated with fear, anxiety, and death? Because it's turned away from it being brought to a place of steady. You see what I'm saying? So it doesn't mean it's being brought down to step and die. And it's turned away from it. So it's a lot of the 8th house associations of fear, anxiety about the future, etc. That's all associated with the same turning. Well, in the 5th house, here we got this little much happier house. Right, you got this is joy of Venus. And it's turned away from the 4th, but it's being brought down there. So this house is associated, but look at how far you've gone. If you're a planet, you've gone from the bottom of the chart all the way through the sky, right? Now you're down in the underworld, and you're turned away from it being brought to that place of the eternal base of things, the beginning and end of things. So you have all sorts of happy recreational things that you do that in some ways you have to do in a spirit of forgetfulness. You have to have fun in the world in a spirit of forgetting the fact. Like, I know I'm a yogi. I own a yoga studio at home. I study yoga philosophy all the time. if you really think about what we're involved in here, it's pretty heavy. You know what I mean? But then you have to sort of set that aside to experience any kind of joy or happiness. You have to be kind of aware of it, but not so aware of it. Even Krishna talks about this in the Bhagavad Gita. He gives a full description of how to live your dharma without renouncing the world as terrible, right? So it's the same thing in the fifth. On some level, it's all about the joy of life, pregnancy, creativity, all these beautiful things that we do to enjoy ourselves. But and the generation of life, the happiness of my wife's pregnant right now, wherever she goes, people smile. You know what I mean? It's just happy. So and it's good fortune, right? But in order to understand the deeper implications of the fifth house, you have to remember that the natural karma, meaning the natural action of the sky, takes this joy and eventually brings it down. I know that's like heavy, but it's very, very important, because what you see commonly in fifth house dynamics with clients is a fine line between recreation and creativity on the one hand, and sort of wasteful, naive, childish behavior that doesn't amount to anything, or that could even get a person in trouble through being somewhat like hedonistic or something like that. So there's,
Like the sun at 10 p.m.
Yeah.
You know, generally speaking.
Right. That's a great
tavern time, but it's going to close at some point.
Right. That pretty soon one of them's going to fall off that table. We know it's coming.
Do you consider it a celebration of the planet's journey through the
Yes.
houses?
Yes. Yeah.
And then when they move into the fourth, you have kind of the hangover. Or
Yeah.
like the next day.
Yes. Yes, precisely. Now I don't want to simplify everything to just this dynamic, because sometimes we have to remember the deeper karmic dynamics in the chart and where it's all heading, and other times it's very important to just, put that in the background rather than the fork. So for example, sometimes fifth house topics, like in a chart, like Jupiter entered Scorpio, my wife's fifth house. I was adamant that we were not going to have another child, right? That didn't last long. Jupiter and Scorpio in her fifth house is so fertile, and no way. So that was like, we had a Halloween party, very Jupiter and Scorpio, and we had don't worry, I won't get too graphic. We had a Halloween party, and several of my wife's friends were pregnant, right? And in this light-spirited mood, we're like, oh, it'd be fun to have another child, right? And flash forward 2 months later, and I'm like,
Think about children in general. In time, what they inherit? They inherit the legacy of this karma. They move from the fifth down to the fourth, right?
So that's the dynamic. So I've been living this for this past year. So sometimes, when it popped up, when Jupiter was like, I was thinking, oh yeah, Jupiter's entering my wife's fifth house. Well, that could be pregnancy. But you don't jump to the conclusion saying, oh, well, that means pregnancy is bad, because in time having a child will lead to some kind of karmic reckoning. I mean, that's true. It will lead to a karmic reckoning. Or anyone's raised kids. My daughter's 2.5, so I'm just learning about all this. But it's another one on the way now. But it is a kind of karmic reckoning. But we don't have to take it so seriously that we say, well, everything in the fifth that's joyful is frivolous. Do you see what I'm saying? It could be frivolous. It might need a karmic reckoning, so to speak. But it's also truly about a joy, a place of joy. Now, when we say it's the house of creativity, one of the reasons I like to try and just knock that down a few pegs is because every client in the world with fifth house planets for like the first couple of years of my practice was instantly an artist, and that became the topic of the session. Oh, you have a couple fifth house planets? Oh my God, you're really creative. You're an artist. Like, go do something with that. Why are you working the corporate job? And then it's like, well, actually, it's much more complex than that. You know what I mean? Like, it's very easy. Creativity is actually every single moment. The sky doesn't stop, So at any rate, yeah. So fifth house, that's where we get some of that stuff from. Now, let's look at some charts. This is a C-rated chart, so I can't say it's 100% accurate, but I like it so much that I don't care. I can do that. Like, I just like it. So anyway, now is Rebecca. I don't know if she appreciates it. Oh, good. I was like, Rebecca just finished a dissertation on Tolkien in the Red Book, and so I'm like scared to talk about something. I'm a real expert in the room with you, but
here's his chart, and you see the sun and Mercury in the whole sign of the fifth house. So he's the whole sign here. When Tolkien was a child, he lost his father to rheumatic fever, and for a time his family was sort of, they lost their income, so what are we going to do? There was another funny story where he was apparently, I read this somewhere, that he was bitten by a large flint spider as a child. It's interesting if you consider the role that spiders play in Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. And then another story was that I read that he was taken away overnight as a young child by a young servant who thought that he was a beautiful child and like took him overnight or something. I don't know if that's true. I guess that's true. I haven't heard it. Okay. Anyway, his mother then died at the age of 12 of acute diabetes, right? As a young man, I think in his early 20s, it was, he fought in World War I. So got trench fever at one point. Anyway, that all sounds pretty heavy for a fifth house sun, right? You'd be like, well, it makes sense because he's a creative, has creative masterpiece, he creates this entire world. He's got the sun in the fifth house, especially in an accomplishing sign like Capricorn or whatever. He builds the world, But you know what? The thing is that if you think about the primary archetype of the characters in Lord of the Ring and Hobbit, it's small, childlike, country-dwelling, innocent kids that inherit the ring, which is like the way of the world. So the whole journey, in some sense, of his artistic legacy has to do with the innocence that he lost as a child. So you got a Capricorn feeling in the fifth house, and the way that it carries down into this very serious place, and yet it's still deeply creative, and it's very joyful, and the hobbits are these very joyful creatures. So I just thought it was fascinating when I was looking at different fifth house sun charts that he was a really good example of one.
Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah.
Okay, here's another one. Here's Yoko Ono's chart with a fifth house sun. Her father was a classical pianist, and she grew up as a child, as an immigrant in the United States. Now, at one point, they went back over to, so first of all, she has the legacy of her father's creative life, so sun in the fifth house, so just can't get more literal than that. But then in time, her creative life becomes very, very serious and intense. And she bears that, in classical astrology, the sun in Aquarius is in its exile. It's in a place that's contrary to its own domicile of Leo. So it's frequently, so now we think of outsiders in Aquarius because we think of the planet Uranus. Traditionally, the same archetype was there because the sun is contrary to its home sign. It means it's in an outsider kind of position. The sun in Aquarius and Saturn sign is associated with outsiders in a sense. Anyway, during the firebombing of Tokyo, she was back in Tokyo for this part of her life. Yoko Ono was with her family and ended up in a bunker because of the firebombing. And the Ono family was, quote, forced to beg for food while pulling their belongings with them in a wheelchair. Ono said it was during this period of her life that she developed her aggressive attitude and understanding of outsider status, which informed all of her artwork. And that was what attracted her, it was in large part what attracted John Lennon to her. And then the creative legacy that she inherits, right, is fraught with the seriousness of things like Vietnam and this countercultural movement and the eventual death of her creative artist husband. And see what I'm saying? So there's, in every fifth house planet, remember that there's always the potential for a very deep and heavy legacy to set in over time, which would be a part of the person's childhood and their relationship to creativity and joy and things like that. It's really actually a very diverse house. Here's a stellium of planets in the fifth house of Steven Spielberg's chart. So his career starts off with films like Jaws, E.T., which seem kind of like adventurous and useful and everything like that. But later into his career, it evolves into things like Schindler's List, Saving Private Ryan, Amistad, genocide, slave trade, you know what I mean? World War II. But even E.T., even though that's more innocent, my daughter's favorite movie is E.T. She's 2.5, and like one night I was bored, and so I turned on E.T. on Netflix or something, and she just fell in love with it completely. So at home right now, I actually have a stuffed E.T. doll in the woods behind her house. Be like really, really fun. right? Anyway, we were in the woods hiking the other day, and she got obsessed with the idea that we were looking for ET in the woods. So we're gonna put an ET in the woods and have some fun. So anyway, 18 is actually about the loss of childhood innocence, right? The encounter with this alien who's far from home, and he's childlike and everything. Same thing with Jaws. In a dark way, it's about the beach, which is a place of fun and beauty and recreation for children and everything like that. And the opening scenes where Jaws attacks, it's like your beach party is interrupted. You know what I mean? So you could think about this. You see people like Bruce Springsteen has a fifth house. Sun, Mercury, I can't remember. He has a pretty solid fifth house, and he's someone who starts off, knife fighting, muscle cars, bubblegum snapping, boardwalk Jersey rocker, and what does he become in time? He becomes an activist. You know what I mean? His music evolves over time. What often happens with the fifth house that these light, joyous topics are all there, but also there's this weight that they can inherit in time or that they're not aware of somehow. So you also see gambling, people with problems with alcohol or overdoing things or, being kind of impulsive or reckless. Anyway, here's Stephen King's chart. Stephen King has Jupiter in the fifth, and the ruler of the fifth, right on his ascendant, is fallen Mars. And it is called Cancer, Mars and Cancer, sorry. And it's in a tight, I think it's about 1 degree trine to Jupiter, right? So Stephen King's career totally embodies these themes. Like, for example, when he was a kid, he saw a friend struck by a train, and then he ended up writing a story about a group of boys who went looking for a dead body. The movie made I'll Stand By Me. Did you guys ever see that?
Yeah.
So it was called The Body. Shawshank Redemption, a man who's innocent who gets imprisoned, right? Have you guys seen? Everyone's seen that one, right? So the loss of innocence, that's a big theme of the fifth house. Also the what am I thinking of? Cujo, a family is a first family dog gone bonkers. Pet Cemetery, family child cats and stuff gone completely crazy. A clown that has gone berserk, a demon clown. Person Atlantis, another innocent story about childhood and loss of innocence. We move on, Misery, about someone who gets trapped in a situation. He's a creative writer who gets stuck in a crazy woman's house. Right? All of this stuff. Well, there's that theme of but it's heavy, it's dark. You've got Jupiter and Scorpio and Mars on the ascendant is fall. Actually, personally, with the ruler of the fifth on his ascendant, he personally embodies those fifth house karmas. For example, he's struck and thrown into a depression off the side of a road by a van and almost killed, right? Just walking along the road. During his major creative moments in his early career, he was totally strung out. He was totally addicted, and he almost died. So you see, with him, there's also this deeply reckless side that's connected to the creative impulse and to the experience of pleasure and joy and so forth. But this happens all over the place. You have one that he wrote recently, which was about a minister who got struck by lightning and basically lost his faith. His wife died suddenly, and then as a minister, he turned away from God and sort of fell and was struck by lightning, and it was just crazy. But again, you have all of his stories typically revolve around something beautiful, innocent, all American, getting shattered by something dark. You see what I'm saying? And that's the Mars, the ruler of the fifth, and he's all right on the ascendant. So he also suffers from it very personally. Okay, so that's what I have for you guys today. I'd be happy to take a few questions. We have just a few minutes left.
So if the planet is moving towards the fourth and is unaware of its motion towards the fourth, how would you describe the symbolism of the sixth that it's gazing upon?
Yeah, Manilius actually mentions that. He says, well, first of all, it doesn't generally seem to be the case that you consider the planets in the succedent houses as looking at the cadent houses. You just consider them as turned away from the angle. It's not necessarily that they're looking at the sixth, but just that they're turned away from the fourth.
Is that an ancient doctrine, or that's Robert Smith?
That's Robert Schmidt. Yeah, yeah. And then then you go into the, but Manilius does say that here you have, with house 5, you have paired up house 6, which is a house of bad fortune. And so it goes that basically he says, so it goes that things go up and things go down. And so the underworld houses, the joys of Mars in the 6th, joy of Venus in the 5th, and Moon in the 3rd, are all the nocturnal feminine planets, which are generally associated with the realm of fortune, the realm of circumstance, and the wheel of karma and things like that. Whereas the spirit planets above, joy of Saturn in the 12th, Jupiter in the 11th, and the Sun in the 9th, are the diurnal masculine planets, so to speak, and they're associated with spirit, which has more, in a sense, it has more to do with rising above or transcending the realm of karma and fortune altogether. Now, those are just like a super brief summary, but yeah.
You find in your work with clients that, like, say, transits to the house ruler are
Yes.
good luck, good fortune?
It depends on the condition of the ruler, right? If the ruler's in what house it's in, what dignity it has, etc. But yeah, transits to the 5th house ruler usually have something to do with the topics of the 5th that we just discussed. Usually I find that, the 2 ways of looking at it are transits to the ruler, maybe the exaltation lord, or transits moving through the 5th house itself. Those are ways of thinking about it. I'll say one last thing. 2 last things. One is that I hope that what you got from this is the idea, again, that if we understand the underlying rationale astronomically, suddenly that 5th house is an experiential and more embodied place. And we have this understanding of its dynamic within the wheel, not just a cut-off place with topics listed. So that's what I hope you got from this. Second, we're speeding to finish. If you enjoyed this, then you might enjoy my course that's coming up starting on June 10th on Sundays from 12 to 2 p.m. every week for a year. There's a course that I lead called Ancient Astrology for Modern Times. And it's basically for people who are interested in this kind of old school astrology, but maybe you're looking for an approach that also is bridging the gap to your modern understanding of astrology. That's not, because sometimes classical astrology, when you learn it, like learning a classical instrument, can be a little dry. So the hope of building the course that I built was that in the first 6 months, you learn all the ancient natal theory, but in the same spirit and manner that you heard it today, kind of like that. But then in the second 6 months, you get to see me working with live clients in the classroom, applying all of the theory, and then we workshop it together. So that's what the program's all about. You can check it out at nightlightastrology.com. You can email me if you'd like a copy of the presentation today at nightlightastrology@gmail.com. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Adam.
Thank you.
Oh, yes. All right.
Oh, I was trying with you. I think sandwich.
Oh, reality sandwich. Yeah. Well, let me close down this meeting.
Congratulations on your meeting coming in.
Thank you.